Welcome to the OnTarget HTML5 website YouTube channel. OnTarget HTML5 is dedicated to teaching web development technologies in HTML5, HTML, CSS, CSS3, PHP, MySQL, Flash, and the XML scripting language. We'll also be adding a JavaScript section to the website over the next few months. I hope you enjoy the tutorial. Welcome back to the CSS3 Essential Training Series. In this tutorial, we're going to look at the box model part 2 in the series. In the previous tutorial, we discussed the box model, presented a representation of the box model on a slide, and then demonstrated normal document flow of an HTML document. Understanding normal document flow will assist you as you begin to learn the box model and begin setting up your HTML documents into web pages. Normal document flow is very important when it comes to fully understanding the box model. Let's take a look at our slide visualization one more time before we jump into our demonstrations. The box model is a term used to describe the rules and properties surrounding the physical properties of all HTML elements that make up your page. Think of it like this, and we discussed this in part 1 of this series. All HTML elements on your page should be considered a box. They're a rectangular box. The properties of this box, its width, its height, its padding, and its margin define the size of the element and how it relates to the elements that are surrounding it. So without these properties, we'd have no control over our layout. So let's look at these one more time real quick. We discussed the content area. That's the actual content of that HTML element. And it's made up of a width and a height. That's the physical width and physical height that the content area takes up in the HTML element. Then we looked at padding, and we talked about how padding separates that content from the border of the HTML element. Remember, padding and the border are part of the width of that content. And you'll see that demonstrated in a minute. And then we looked at margin. And margin is what pushes that element or that HTML element, that box, away from the elements that are around it. So it's really important that we understand these different things that make up that HTML element as we start to get into positioning our elements on our HTML page. So let's move into our development environment and look at some of the examples that we're going to have for this box model. Alright, so let's go ahead and move into our development environment. Let me go ahead and minimize that presentation. I want you to confirm that you've got your WAMP server up and running, that your Apache server is running, if that's the server that you're using for the demonstrations, and you've got your MySQL and PHP running. Although we're not going to be using MySQL and PHP in this tutorial, it probably should be running so that you get the best benefit out of your XAMPP server. Next, I'd like to show you the directory structure that we're going to be using. So let me go ahead and minimize that screen. The directory structure we're going to be using for this tutorial. Again, just like the previous tutorial, I've got my CSS directory, my images folder, I've got my basic template, which we're not starting with, but I usually try to keep that included in all our exercise files, and the box model 02_04, picking up where we left off from that previous tutorial. Now, one thing I will tell you is we're going to change the HTML document a little bit, because I want to go through this. I want to start out with some very simple things as we look at this box model, and then as we progress, we'll get a little more complex, so that you can see the differences in how things work, how margins and paddings and borders interact with one another. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that screen. Let's go ahead and bring up our text editor. I'll be using Sublime Text 2, as I have in all my previous examples thus far. And I'm going to bring up the web server. This time I'm actually going to use the Safari web browser. No particular reason, I just like to switch up the web browser so that we make certain that we have compatibility with all the different things, all the different browser intricacies as we move forward. You'll see that I've got my box model 0204 HTML file, my 2 folders, and the basic template loaded. One thing I do want to point out, we're going to do something a little bit different in this tutorial, and if you have a copy of the exercise files, you can go ahead and bring this up in your text editor. If not, now would be a good time to pause this video and go ahead and copy or type into your text editor the top portion of our HTML document. I'll give you a moment, then we'll scroll down so you can get the bottom portion. Alright, let's go ahead and scroll down so you can get the bottom portion of the document. You'll notice I've got inside my body element, I've got a div with an ID of container. Then I have 2 divs with two paragraphs, one paragraph in each div, so that we can actually see some of the content as we start doing these demonstrations. But what I want to point out, and we're going to go up here so we can, now would be a good time, by the way, to pause if you need to copy the bottom portion of this file. All right, one of the things I want to point out is we're going to do things a little bit differently in this demonstration. I've been using external style sheets with all the configurations that we've been doing for styling. As we're going through the box model, I'm actually going to style in the head element of the HTML document. And the only reason I'm doing that so you can see the interaction so we're not flipping back and forth between files. It'll be easier for you to see what's going on as we apply the styling and then just refresh our browser window on the left. But I'm keeping our style sheet attached. If you remember correctly, we've got this style sheet attached. I've got it loaded, and I'm going to go ahead and pause. Now would be a good time for you to pause if you don't have this copied in. This is our CSS reset, and that's why we're keeping the style sheet attached. I want to keep that style sheet in that reset so that when we load up this file, everything's starting out from 0. So all my browsers, whether it be Safari or Firefox or Chrome or Explorer or Opera, which are the major browsers that we have out there, all the browsers are going to be having the same starting point. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down so you can get the rest of the CSS reset in the event you don't have access to the exercise files. All right, so let's go ahead back to our box model _02_04. I'm going to load this up in my browser window so you can see how we're starting out. And this is our starting point for this tutorial. All right, so the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and start setting up our page so we can start seeing how these different properties interact with one another. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead to my exercise file, example 3, and I'm going to, inside my style tags, remember this is the first time we've actually styled the document inside style tags inside the head setting, or the head elements, but I want to do that because I think it's easier for you to see what's going on instead of constantly flipping back and forth between different files. I'm going to go ahead and add a styling for my HTML element. And remember, we talked about normal document flow. HTML element is the very first element inside of our HTML file. It's our root element. And all I want to do, and again, I'm only doing this so we have the contrast, we can actually see what's occurring, is I'm going to give it a background color. So I want you to go ahead and save that change. Go ahead and type that in if you need to. Now would be a good time to pause. I want you to refresh your browser window, and you should notice now that we get a pretty decent gray background across our entire HTML element. And again, that is the entire, I'm going to go ahead and expand our browser windows so you can see what I mean. That is the entire browser window. Everything that we see displayed inside the browser is part of the root element. The next setting I'm actually going to put in, and again, I'm doing this so that we can see what's going on as we start going through this demonstration. I want to put a little bit of formatting in our body element. So I'm going to get my opening and closing body tags. And again, part of example 3 inside our exercise files, I want to go ahead and add some styling to that. Go ahead and clean up my tabs here. Just paste this in from the exercise file. You can go ahead and pause the video if you need to right now to go ahead and type that in. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Now what I'm doing is I'm actually giving the width 80%, and what that means is I'm telling the body, remember the body is the very next element that's inside of our HTML. We have a head tag, which is a section of our content, or of our HTML element, and then we have a body tag, which contains the content of our HTML element. I'm telling the body element, I want you to be 80% of the width of the HTML element. So whatever that width is, I want you to be 80% of it. I want you to calculate the margin right and margin left automatically. So in other words, look at the difference from the 80%, considering what our width is, and calculate that difference, and keep myself centered. This actually has the effect of centering that body element in our page. Go ahead and save those changes and refresh your browser window, and you should see exactly what I mean now, because now our content, those div tags, have actually shrunk down to be 80% of the width of the HTML element. And if you go ahead and stretch that out, you'll see that it maintains that 80% width. It's called the responsive design. So now we're 80% of the width of the HTML element. And now getting into what we're here for, right below the body tag, let's go ahead and put in a div element with our opening and closing braces. And all I want to do here is put in a background color, because we're going to start out, I want you to see the impact that the actual div element has by itself. So we're just going to change its background, we're just going to change its background color to a light blue. And again, good time to pause and type in if you don't have access to the exercise files. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser window, and now you can see that we actually have that light blue background, and you can see how the content of that paragraph tag is butting up against the edges of our div element, because as we discussed in the presentation, that's exactly what should be occurring because we don't have any padding set. No margins or anything based on our CSS reset that we have set up in our external CSS file. Remember, we have none of this we have no margins and padding and border or any of that stuff. So right now everything is at 0. We've given our div a background color so you can see what's occurring in the background of that div tag. All right, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go ahead and save this file. Let's go ahead and save it as. We will do a save as. Let's go ahead and read this in here. I want to save this as 02_05. So again, if you have access to the exercise files, you'll have the different stages as we walk through this. What I want to do next is I want to go ahead and make some additions to our div element. I want to go ahead and give it a width and a height. So I'm going to keep our background color the way it is inside of our div element. And again, if you've got access to the exercise files, these will be under example 4 in the exercise files folder. If not, I'm sure you can just type them in with us. I'm going to type in a width, and I want to give it a width of 200 pixels. I want to come right below that and give it a height, and I want to give it a height of 300 pixels. And with that change, I actually want to go and make a change, a slight change to our body element. Because in order for me to really demonstrate what's going on here, one, I want you to be able to see the difference. I want you to see where the body element is. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a width of 400 pixels. And I actually want to give it a background color also. So I'm going to give it a background color of white. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Again, we're on underscores, that's the box model _02_05.html. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser window. Now we're going to have to go back and reload that file. So let's go back and refresh our browser window, load the 0205 HTML file, and you'll see now that we actually have a size for our div elements. We've given them a width of 200 pixels inside of our body element, which is actually 400 pixels wide now. And we've actually given them a height of 300 pixels. Notice that since we have no padding and margins, these things are butted up right against one another. And again, the text is right inside the element. Since we've given them a height and it's not auto, that's where this additional space is coming from. This first div element is 300 pixels high, and the second div element is 300 pixels high. And you notice they've exceeded our body element. They've actually, we call it overflow. They've actually overflowed the body element. But we'll work with that as we go through here. So what I want to do now, let's talk about padding, because there's a lot of confusion around padding. When you add padding to an element, a lot of people think if I make my div element 200 pixels wide and I add 10 pixels of padding to it that go all the way around the element, the width of that element will now be 180 pixels wide, because I'll have 10 pixels of padding on the left and right, and because it's only 200 pixels wide, it's coming from that 200 pixels, and that's not true. Padding is actually added to the width of the element. So if I've given the element a width of 200 pixels and I add 10 pixels of padding all the way around it, my width now is 220 pixels, and the height, because we've designated the height here as 300 pixels because I've added 20 pixels of padding, both top, 10 pixels top, 10 pixels bottom. So let's emphasize a little bit what we're talking about as we add this padding to this content element. All right, so we've got our content element and we've got our padding. The light blue signifies 10 pixels of padding around our content element, and the content width is 200 pixels with a content height of 50 pixels. Now we add 10 pixels of padding around the entire element. So now our element width is 10 pixels plus 200 pixels plus 10 pixels. In other words, I'm getting the 200 pixels from the content element itself, 10 pixels on the right, 10 pixels on the left. That's going to give me a content width of 220 pixels. The same thing with the element height. I've got an element height of 50 pixels, and I have 10 pixels on the top, 10 pixels on the bottom. That's going to give me an element height of 70 pixels. So it's adding to the actual height and width of that particular element. And that can really blow up your layouts. I mean, when you're starting to get into pixel-based layouts, you've got to understand how the padding is added to the width and height. as well as the border in order to define the size that these elements are going to take up inside your layout. So padding adds to the total width. Width and height of the div element define content width and content height, not overall measurements. So when I'm defining a width here and a height here, I'm defining the width and height of the content element itself, not the overall div element. And to demonstrate that, let me show you what I mean. Let's go ahead and add some padding to our div element. I'm going to add 15 pixels of padding to this element. I'm going to go ahead and save this change. I'm going to refresh my browser. Now watch what happens with our text. Go ahead, you can pause the video if you need to type that in. Now when I refresh the browser, you're going to see that 15 pixels of padding, and because this is shorthand notation, this is top, right, bottom, left. So we're adding 15 pixels of padding entirely around it. But watch what happens to the width and height of my div element when I refresh my browser. Notice how it became much bigger, because we've added that 30 pixels of padding both on the right and the left and the top and the bottom. We've actually added that to it. So it's important that you understand what we've just done there. So, and in order to understand how this is actually impacting the content, let's create another selector so that we can actually visualize what's going on here. I'm going to go ahead and create a P selector for a paragraph tag. So let's come right below that div element. Let's look at just the content of the actual div element, and all I want to do is give it a background color. So I'm going to give this a background color. We're going to give it a light yellow so you can see the difference between the actual content element and the actual div. So see, now you can see where the content is in reference to the div, and you'll notice we've got the 15 pixels of padding, top, bottom, left, and right. It's hard to visualize left and right yet because we haven't played with any of the margins, but you'll see that shortly. But you can see now that we're actually picking up that padding inside. The content element is still, you know, it is what it is. We told it it's 200 pixels wide, it's 200 pixels wide. But because we've added this padding, top, bottom, left, and right, we now have a width of 230 pixels and a height of 330 pixels. So it's important to understand the interaction between that. And as we get into borders, they too add to that pixel width. So let's continue to march. Let's go ahead and save our work before we make any more changes. Let's do a save as, and let's go ahead and save this as 02_06.html. So that during the next demonstrations we have a fresh file to work with, and we haven't overwritten all these changes that we made. One of the things I want to talk about really quick is when we were going through our block level elements discussion, we talked about how block level elements tend to take all the vertical space available inside of their elements. So what if I didn't define a width and a height for our div element? Well, how would that paragraph element react to that? So let's go ahead real quick and just remove those, the width and height. Let's go ahead and save that change and refresh your browser window. And actually we're going to have to go back and reload the browser window because we got to go load up 06, which has our changes in it. And you'll notice now what they've done is they take up all the available space inside the body element, because we've given the body element a width of 400 pixels. By not defining the width of that div tag, they are taking up all the space available to them inside the body element. Now they're maintaining their padding because we still have to define what the padding is, but now they're taking up all the available space that's available inside that body element based on the settings that we've given it inside the definitions or the properties of the body element itself. And it's important to remember that our block level elements will take up all the available space they have unless we physically define what their dimensions are. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about borders and how they impact our box model. We're starting exactly where we just left off. We've got our 0206 HTML file on our desktop. What I want to do now is I want to go in and let's look at the impact that borders have on our box model. I'm going to go to my div tag and I want to add a border around it. And again, these are all part of your exercise folder if you have access to the exercise files. I'm just going to put a 1 pixel solid border, and I'm going to give it a black color. Go ahead and add, and I want to do the same thing with my paragraph tag. I want to add another selector to the paragraph tag. I'm going to just go ahead and copy this selector I put on the div tag. Come on down to my paragraph tag. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in place. I just want to change the color, and I want to make this one 2 pixels so it stands out a little better. And I'm going to make this a C0C color. This is my hexadecimal color definitions for anyone that's curious why I'm using these hexadecimal values. It's how I usually do my colors on my websites. All right, let's go ahead and save those changes. Let's do a save as _0207 so that you have those in your exercise files. Also, this would be a great time to pause the movie before we demonstrate what's going on here and type in those 2 additions, one to the div tag and one to the paragraph tag that we've got inside of our style definitions. Now let's go back in our browser window. Let's go grab that, refresh that screen, go grab that 07 file, and you'll notice now that we've got these borders around here. But because I've loaded a new file, I want to go ahead and pull these out. I'm just going to go ahead and comment these. By the way, this is a great way to look at the impact of something on your styling. You can actually comment it out, which is what we're going to do right here, because I want you to see the impact it has before and after. We're going to comment these files out. I want to do a save. I want to refresh this window. So there we are without the borders in. Now when I bring these borders in and refresh that browser window, I want you to see the impact that they have on the areas that both the div and the paragraph tag take up inside that body element. So let's go ahead and save that change. I've removed those comments. Refresh the browser window, and you'll notice now that everything kind of shifted down and shifted over to the right. And again, because just like the padding, when we've given these things a width, or we've told them to take up all the available width because we haven't defined the width, that padding and border add to that. All right, so just as has occurred when we added the padding, when we add these borders, we're going to run into the same thing that we did with the padding with our element. So we're going to have our content height of 50 pixels, our content width of 200 pixels. We had the padding of 10 pixels around it, just as we did in the previous demonstration, but now we had a 5 pixel border that also goes all the way around that element, top, bottom, right, and left. So now when we calculate the element width, we actually have 5 pixels for the border on the left, 10 pixels for the padding on the left, 200 pixels for the content width, 10 pixels for the padding on the right, 5 pixels for the border on the right, and that's going to give us a total of 230 pixels. So now the content element that was 200 pixels wide because of our padding and border is now 230 pixels wide. And the same thing is going to occur with the height. We have 5 pixels of border on the top, 10 pixels of padding on the top, our 50 pixels of border height or content height, our 10 pixels of padding on the bottom, and our 5 pixels of border on the bottom is going to give us 80 pixels of content height. So it's very important that we remember that we've got to calculate this padding and this border into the size of these actual elements. So we're actually decreasing, or increasing, I should say, I'm sorry, we're increasing the area that's being taken up now by the width and height of these elements by adding padding and border to these. And you'll actually notice at the top that the borders are stacking one on top of the other. On the paragraph side, we only have a 1 pixel border. But if you look at the bottom of the top paragraph and the top of the bottom paragraph, you'll see that's actually 2 pixels apart because we have a 1 pixel border for the bottom paragraph and a 1 pixel border for the top paragraph. And because of that, when they come together, we actually have 2 pixels in height. And we will continue this in part 3 of the series. We're going to continue to look at the impact that these properties have on our box level elements, and we're going to start looking at margins. So I look forward to seeing you in that tutorial. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can be notified of tutorials as they're posted. And don't forget to check out our website, www.ontargethtml5.com, for a complete listing of all the tutorials that are available for viewing. There's many more than we don't have posted up on YouTube. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you for visiting the OnTarget HTML5 YouTube channel.